So I'd now like to introduce Mr. John Kennedy, who serves as the Deputy Director for Internal Operations at the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. He began his career at the Wyoming Game and Fish Department in 2004 as the Service Division Chief. In that role, his duties included coordinating the agency's management of wildlife habitat as well as conservation education. Now, as Deputy Director, Mr. Kennedy is responsible for the agency's oversight of the Fish, Wildlife Services, and the fiscal divisions. He also serves on a number of committees of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies and the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. Each of these positions has provided Mr. Kennedy with valuable wildlife conservation, recovery, and management expertise. He also is a proud and distinguished graduate of a program that I've also attended and graduated from, Leadership Wyoming. So, Mr. Kennedy, it's a privilege to welcome you today to the Environment and Public Works Committee. Please proceed.
Good morning, Chairman Barrasso, Ranking Member Carper, and members of the committee. My name is John Kennedy, and I'm with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the reference to the work that's taking place in Wyoming with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. I appreciate that, and we'll be sure to pass that on to our employees. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today about wildlife conservation in Wyoming. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, as you know, the 50 states have the primary legal authority and management responsibility for a great deal of the country's wildlife resources. States have specific authority for wildlife management within their borders, including most federal lands. In the late 1800s, the nation's wildlife resources were depleted due to unregulated hunting and habitat loss. In order to protect the resource, hunters and anglers advocated for regulations for hunting and measures to protect valuable habitat. These efforts led to the creation of the North American model of wildlife conservation, which has two main areas of focus. Fish and wildlife belong to all citizens, and wildlife management for perpetual sustainability. To carry out the management charge granted by the Constitution, every state has an agency dedicated to manage wildlife resources within their borders. In spite of limited funding, state agencies have garnered considerable expertise in response to the growing need to address at-risk and imperiled species and to carry out management responsibilities across the country. On average, 60 to 90% of state wildlife agency budgets are derived by hunters and anglers. Management of wildlife and the habitats that support them is partially funded through excise taxes on hunting and fishing equipment collected under the federal authority of the Pittman-Robertson and Dingell-Johnson Acts, which have been a critical source of wildlife conservation funding in the United States for over 80 years. The sale of hunting and fishing licenses significantly contribute to the conservation efforts at the state level. In Wyoming, hunters and anglers fund the department's work almost entirely. The collective annual budget of state wildlife agencies is significant, $5.6 billion. Nearly 59%, that's $3.3 billion, comes from hunting and fishing-related activities, either directly through the sale of licenses, tags, and stamps, or indirectly through federal excise taxes on hunting, fishing, and recreational shooting equipment. Despite this hunting and fishing-specific funding model, state wildlife agencies have a long history of success in restoring many species, both game and non-game. It has been long recognized that the traditional focus of state wildlife agencies has been on the conservation of game species, but more attention and funding has been directed toward the conservation of non-game species. This shift was the impetus for development of state wildlife action plans and the State Wildlife Grants Program. Each state has a plan developed that identifies the species of greatest conservation need in the state and provides for the inventory, research, and management actions necessary to conserve those species. The need for a new and broader funding is reflected in one of the recommendations made by the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies Blue Ribbon Panel on Sustaining America's Diverse Fish and Wildlife Resources. That recommendation is to secure an additional $1.3 billion for the Wildlife Conservation Restoration Program and is the impetus for our current work on the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. In Wyoming, the responsibilities of the department are defined in Wyoming statute and charge the agency to provide an adequate and flexible system for the control, management, protection, and regulation of all Wyoming wildlife. The department manages over 800 wildlife species. The department's core priority is to manage wildlife using sound scientific principles while maintaining stakeholder satisfaction. This includes actively monitoring wildlife populations, adjusting regulations to ensure sustained use, conducting research, enforcing wildlife laws and regulations, conserving and restoring habitat, and maintaining and increasing public access for hunting and fishing. While there are significant challenges to managing certain species and habitats, state wildlife agencies are the best to address those challenges, just as Wyoming has done with the greater sage grouse, black-footed ferrets, grizzly bears, and wolves. It's also worth noting that the dozens of wildlife that faced serious challenges nearly 100 years ago that were brought back through state-led collaborative conservation efforts, including mule deer, moose, elk, and pronghorn antelope. As you can see in my written testimony, there are many examples of successful state conservation, recovery, management of wildlife in Wyoming, including work on threatened and endangered species, non-game, and game. This includes successful conservation work on the bald eagle, peregrine falcon, and again, sage grouse, grizzly bears, gray wolf, and black-footed ferrets. Mr. Chairman, as you referenced in the introduction, there's also examples of successful state management of invasive species. In terms of aquatic invasive species, we've been successful in keeping 2 species of concern out of our waters, those being quagga and zebra mussels. And although managing cheatgrass has proven to be extremely challenging and costly, we've accomplished successful site-specific treatments in certain areas of Wyoming. We're also controlling certain terrestrial invasive species on wildlife habitat areas that we manage throughout the state. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today and to talk about Wyoming's work to conserve, recover, and manage wildlife. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.